Hi, everyone. Welcome to our intermission program. We're so glad you're here. Intermission was created to give support and education to our community. And today we have the wonderful Summer Forlenza with us. She's been here before. She's a licensed marriage family counselor, therapist, and she specializes in anxiety and depression, of course, but PTSD and complex PTSD, which comes from childhood. Summer, thanks so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to hang out with you and talk mental health.
Yeah, I know. We love it. Yeah, so today we're going to talk about emotion, kind of emotional regulation 101.
Mhm.
But I think we're going to focus more on like identifying emotions, right? And which I think some people listening will say, like, why do we need to do that? Which is so fun because there's so many whys.
Mhm.
Yeah. And so our goal today is that people just walk away knowing a little bit more about their emotions or how they feel, or I think that's a good goal.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, if people can leave this conversation feeling like they understand why it would be important to be able to name your emotions and how that actually helps you and the people around you, I would feel like we had succeeded.
right. And I love that you mentioned the people around you, because I think
Mhm.
sometimes we don't want to take the time for ourselves, but for all those people out there, either supervising, managing people, or if you have kids or you're in
Yep.
relationships, right? I mean, I think any human, like this will help you interact with any other human, but I think you brought up a good point there. Um, yeah,
Yeah, I
so
always think it's helpful to recognize the way that when we help ourselves, we also help everyone that's in our orbit, and
for
everyone else's
sure.
lives improves as well. So I'm excited to talk about this with you.
Great. Great. Well, we talked about starting out with kind of like the basics
Mhm.
about maybe a little bit about like Dan Siegel does the upstairs downstairs brain. I just actually heard him say that. I just thought it was a little clever way to say it. But you
Yes.
want to talk a little bit about it and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, totally. So Dan Signal, I really like his hand brain, and I use
Me
this to
too.
explain to clients all the time. So if my
Mhm.
brain is your hand, other way around, if my hand is your brain, then the way we're going to think about this is that your part of your brain is responsible for thinking, and I always point to my forehead because it's right here. This is the part of our
Right.
brain that's responsible for language and thoughts, and then other parts of our brain are responsible for feeling and reacting, basically.
Mhm.
And so when our brain is what we can look at like this, like a closed fist, that means that everything is kind of working normally and we can feel things, react to things, and think about things at the same time. When we are emotionally overwhelmed, when we're feeling a big emotion or when we're very scared, also, what can happen is that he talks about it like popping up is a way to think about it.
Mhm.
One part of our brain gets overwhelmed and another part disconnects. And the part that disconnects is our thinking brain, our language brain. So
Right.
that's why if we're like feeling really, really scared, for example, we are just going without thinking, right? We just react
Mhm.
and we don't have access to all of our words and rational thought and things like that. And the reason why we're talking about this when it comes to emotions is that
Right.
one of the ways that we can actually help ourselves to be less reactive and more proactive, more responsive, more engaged in what we're doing is to start engaging our thinking brain. And so when we start to figure out, let me pause, what am I feeling right now? What's happening for me? And we
Mhm.
actually put language to it that assists the process of our brain coming back here so that we are
Mhm.
fully engaged in that. That's what
Right.
I always like to talk about.
Yeah, me too. And that, like, he talks about flipping your lid. So, like,
Mm-hmm.
right. And the other thing I wanted to add, because I like the flipping the lid, because that's how we feel, right? Like,
Yep.
we get cut off in traffic, a partner or a friend says something, and we feel, I mean, maybe we don't name it, but we feel like pulling away or we feel like fighting, whatever it
Mm-hmm.
is. Like, those are the reactions we're talking about. You and your lid flips, and you go into that fight, flight, or freeze or fawn.
Mm-hmm.
um they've added another one, I think, but like that limbic brain, they call it the emotional brain. And
Mm-hmm.
the other thing I wanted to add to what you said, it was a beautiful explanation, is the thinking brain is also the dreaming and planning. That
Oh.
always helps me to think, like, because like when we're in a really emotional state, we cannot think, dream, or plan. And I think
Mm.
that's so important for us to understand as humans. Like, literally, if I feel like if we all understood that, we would become so much more kind to each other. Not saying we would allow people to be abusive or neglectful or anything, but we would be able to say that person is having an overreaction and I don't need to get involved in what they're feeling, right? Yeah. So
yeah, I think it does help to build empathy for people who are acting in ways that are hard to be around. If we can recognize, like, a lot of times their brains are like this, they're in an overwhelmed place. And so they're not really rationally thinking through what's happening. That doesn't mean you have to put up with it or anything, like you're saying.
For sure.
But I'm like, okay, it helps me to feel more patient and not take it as personally if I can recognize that that's part of what's happening.
Right. And we've all experienced it when somebody does this and we're feeling okay, we might do this.
Yes.
So then you have two people that are not able to think, dream, or plan about the future.
And they're arguing.
And they're arguing. Right? Because they're reacted to each other. So a little bit about what we're going to talk today is about how we can become less reactive. And at the same time, I want to underscore, we want people to feel their emotions. Like, I feel like some of the regulation stuff is kind of like thinking we can become this person that doesn't get impacted. That's not it. Our emotions are there to guide us, which, why don't they teach us that in kindergarten, Summer?
There's so many things that I think you and I should be teaching all the K through 12, like some of these basics. We always talk about this. But I think you're saying something that's so important, right? Is like, I do think that there is this desire a lot of people have, especially in the world we live in, where we're all so busy and we have all these demands on our time and our energy, where it's like, wouldn't it be nice to just not feel emotions? And wouldn't it be nice if I could just kind of skip that? And maybe my emotional regulation should be getting out of the emotion as quickly as possible. And it's so important to recognize that our emotions actually evolved for a real important purpose, and they serve an important purpose still in our lives. They help us primarily, I would say, with our relationships. They help us connect to other people, understand other people, help other people understand us. And that is like the baseline of like everything.
Like everything.
Like everything. Like the relationships we have with other people, how we can work with other people, how we feel with other people is the foundation.
And then adding to that, I think it could go right along in there, is it's guiding us.
Yes.
Do I feel terrible at the job that I have, or do I feel terrible in this relationship? It doesn't mean there's something wrong with us. It usually means there's something wrong in the system. But we tend to I just don't think I wasn't taught this. This took me a very long time to get. I had to do a lot of training. I had to spend a lot of money.
I do think, like, anger is one I like to talk about here, right? Like, when we feel angry, like, I think so many of us are trained to disconnect from anger entirely, don't yell, anything like that. And then the only time anger ever comes out is when it's super explosive, right? And then it becomes this thing where we fear it. And we can understand that, like, I always talk to my clients, anger, if you're feeling angry, that is a message that that's a sign that there's something wrong, that something needs to be addressed, right? If your anger is actually so important, like, if people didn't get angry when things were wrong, nothing would ever change for the better.
Nothing would change.
Anger changes the world all the time, and it can be used in a way that's healthy and safe, but it's harder to do that when we can't connect to it. Right. So we can use anger as an example of like regulating through anger. Right. So anger shows up in the body. Right. I always start by, it shows up always as a sensation. That's the first way you're going to feel any emotion ever. A lot of folks I find feel anger in like their face or their hands. Right. A lot of like fist clenching, but your anger is going to show up in your body. And then you're going to start feeling like you're going to start feeling the emotion, and you're going to feel like restless and tight and hot and whatever else it feels like for you, and wanting to react from it, right? You might get a little bit closer to here and start wanting to react from it. And what we can do in that moment is take a pause and say, oh, that thing's happening with my hands and I'm starting to feel hot. I'm getting angry. I'm feeling angry. And even just naming it out loud in your mind, or actually out loud, I'm feeling really angry right now. Helps to bring the brain here. It's so important. And then allows you to say, okay, what's happening? Where's this anger coming from? Let me get curious.
Yeah, you brought up the other piece about Dan Siegel. He came up with that name it to tame it.
Yes.
Which, people feel different ways about these sayings, but it's just reminding us that when we actually go, oh, okay, I'm feeling anger, or I'm sad, or I'm happy. We're naming it, or it's a way then that I mean, he says tame it, right? I don't know if it's a wild animal per se, but it is something that we can go, because sometimes we can get angry. And if we learned how to suppress, which a lot of us have learned how to do from childhood, is like, I don't want to feel that. So then maybe we get, maybe we say something in an email that we wouldn't normally say, or maybe we just withdraw from people, right? Like there's so many different ways that we don't deal with what it is. So I think that naming it is it sounds like a basic thing. I think some people might go like, what? But think about it. Like there's a lot of times we feel stuff. We don't really know what we're feeling. And then we don't want to feel it. So we start to move away, which is such a big, we can kind of talk a little bit about that as well. Like, because I think that moving away is a clue that you're feeling something you don't want to feel. So like,
Yes.
right?
Yes. And and one of the things we had, there's so many things I want to say. I am thinking about how like when we are there's a lot of us have patterns of things that we go to avoid certain emotions.
So
Right?
true, right?
We have patterns where like for some people it is scrolling on your phone, for other people it's watching TV, for other people it's going on running a lot, for other people it's eating or snacking. We have so many different things that we'll turn to because we're uncomfortable and we don't want to be with that discomfort. We have an emotion that we don't want to be with. And when we do that, when we get stuck in that pattern, a lot of times we end up doing things that are actually really harmful to us, and they make us feel bad, and they make us pull away from people, and
or they're actually physically bad for our bodies.
or they're really they're bad for our physical health. People who smoke cigarettes, like a lot of that's like, all right, I get a little break from what's happening. I get a little cool down. Very bad for the body, feels good in the moment, right? And so I think it's really helpful, like if we can start to be like, okay, I'm feeling really worried. When I feel worried, I tend to want to start scrolling on TikTok and just avoiding that, right? That's my go-to. I want to be on TikTok, avoid that. I could do that for a little bit, but usually when I scroll TikTok, I get stuck there for a long time, and then my shoulders hurt because I was like this for an hour, and then I didn't do anything with my day, and I'm so lethargic. All right, when I feel worried, what's a different way that I can be with that worry? Or how can I process this worry? Or what am I worried about? Is there something I need to address? Right? And we can start by naming it. It helps us to be able to actually work with it rather than just like this kind of nebulous, like I feel bad and I don't want to feel bad thing that I think a lot of people feel stuck in.
Yeah. And I think it can also bring up bad feelings or numbed feelings from childhood. Because, a lot of people say, oh, I had a good childhood. And a lot of people have good enough childhoods. But then there were probably times where you were feeling a feeling and either nobody noticed because maybe parents were working or everyone was too busy, or it made your parents uncomfortable. So you pushed it down. Like, you know what I mean? So like all these things happen for us to learn, like, hey, it's not okay to feel. So I guess I'm just shouting out to everybody who might be like, well, why do we do that? That's why. There's a reason why. And us getting curious going, oh, like I just scrolled on. I mean, I tell folks, even if you notice later in the day or even the next day, you go, oh, I watched 13 hours of whatever, like 13 episodes, whatever. And the next day you realize like, oh, I got lost. I was not wanting to feel something. I mean, whatever it is. Or if you get really angry, like we were talking about anger before, get really angry at somebody, then maybe later, once you cool down, you could go, what was that really about? Like to get curious and think, like, what's happening there? What else is there? So
100%. You're making me think like what might be helpful is to kind of go to, like we talked about emotion regulation 101. Like let me just give like the emotions 101, right?
Okay,
so
good.
The movie I love to reference because a lot of people have seen it, and I actually think they did quite a good job at representing emotions, and they worked with actual psychologists to develop this. This is the movie Inside Out, that Pixar movie. So people are probably familiar with the little characters, sadness and joy and anger. And these are kind of, we can think of these as sort of our 5 core emotions. So any of the emotions we feel, we can pretty much categorize as one or a combination of those, as one of those, primary emotions. So that's sadness, joy, anger, disgust, and fear. And
Mhm.
those are the 5 things. If you're sitting there and you're like, I feel really bad, or I'm feeling a big thing and I don't know what it is, I want you to go to those 5 and be like, which one is it closest to? Which one of these
Right.
is this
Good.
closest to? And that's a way to get started because I think it can feel super overwhelming if you've not had any practice trying
Hmm.
to identify how you feel, even if you know it's helpful. Because it's like, I
Hmm.
just feel bad and I don't know what else to tell you. I feel bad.
Right. And yeah, and what does bad mean? I mean, that's what you're
Exactly.
saying. Bring in the curiosity to go like,
So
and you
many different
probably
flavors of bad.
so many different flavors. And that movie is it is a good they do a good job of giving examples of when those emotions show up,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like when she moves, the sad, those sad ones having real difficulties. And I mean, it is a clever film in that way to like help us. So that I guess maybe they are teaching kindergartners.
I suppose they are, huh? Yeah, another thing they did so well there that I think is such a good example of how even the emotions that are uncomfortable that we feel, how they serve us and how they help us, right? So we
Mm,
think about sadness in that film. There was a piece of what was happening, this dynamic between her and Joy, where Joy was like, "You're sad, go away. We don't want you here. I just want her to be happy all the time." But
mhm,
sadness really had to kind of show it's actually really important to be able to express loss and sadness when it happens because it helps you to connect with people. That's what helped the main
mhm,
character like connect with her family, right? Is they can be like, we're sad. I miss my old home. I miss my old
mhm.
life. And that brings people together. It doesn't mean it's comfortable,
Right.
but if we can say, hey, I'm really sad and I really need someone to just listen to me right now. I really need
Mhm,
someone to just be with me right now. Can you just let me be sad and be with you? We can
mhm.
figure out what we need once we know what the emotion is.
Yeah. And then also there, I think I know they've done research on this, but like
Mm.
once you feel it, once you acknowledge it and you say, oh yeah, I'm sad, a lot of times the emotion will move through, right?
Yes.
But there's a lot of us out here that get stuck
Hmm.
because we don't allow it to move through. But then once you learn how to let it move through, you're like, oh, I can handle that. I
Hmm.
can that can move through. Like you said, there's some sensations, or maybe it's like sad feelings. But our systems want to regulate us too, I think. Um,
Yes, yes,
right.
definitely. Yeah, we can sometimes talk about riding the wave of an emotion, right? So
Mhm.
I say this to folks all the time. Any emotion you have ever felt and any emotion you ever will feel always starts and then peaks, gets stronger, peaks, and then comes back down before it's gone.
That's
Every
so
single
true.
time. And so whatever you're feeling now can do that same thing. But if we can, it's like you said, you can get stuck here where we're
Hmm.
just kind of avoiding it, we're trying to distract from it, and then it doesn't get to do its thing where is able
Hmm.
to actually move through. And actually a lot of times like those really intense emotions that we feel will only be with us at their most intense peak level for a few minutes. It's really
Hmm.
actually not that long most of the time once they're at that
Hmm.
peak. Maybe we're hanging out on the up here or down here for a little while longer, but the peak is not very long. And so one of the things that we're going to learn, that we can learn when we're dealing with big emotions is, all right, let me check in. Like, what am I feeling? How's it showing up? How am I going to sit with it and tolerate it and be like,
Hmm.
all right, this sucks. It's happening. What is it trying to tell me? So that I can make space for it to pass.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of like just awareness and being with right there, isn't it? And
Hmm.
I think it's just we need to underline that for folks because I mean that was something that took me a while to learn. Like we have more control than we think, right?
Hmm.
Like we oftentimes think it's, oh, I've got to go take that class or go to therapy or go do this or whatever it is to feel better. But it's often we know what we need to do, and it's to feel and to be seen. So that's another piece of this. Like loneliness is a big thing. So it's important that you're seen in how you feel. Um,
Hmm.
and just acknowledge, even if you say to somebody, I'm not, they don't need to solve the problem, but like, hey, I'm feeling really lousy. We all know how that feels when somebody notices or sees us. It
Hmm.
feels good.
Yeah, and I think you're making me think about, some of the strategies that I recommend for folks if you're like, okay, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling mad, I'm feeling scared. What do I do with that?
Mm-hmm.
So I think if My number one thing is if it's available to you, a safe person who you can connect with in that moment is my top priority, like my number one
Mhm.
recommendation. Find someone safe, and by safe I mean someone who cares for you, someone who you can trust to be kind to you, someone who's going to be consistent with you. Um,
Mhm.
and ask them, be like, hey, I'm feeling angry. Like, do you have some space right now? Because I'd really like to talk about something that's on my mind. I'd really like some space. And just a place where you can talk out loud about what you're feeling and be
Right.
validated, or have somebody ask questions to help you understand it. So,
Mhm.
so helpful. And this can be a therapist. It's a lot of what we do, right? Is we provide that
Yeah.
space. And we provide that because actually it is kind of hard to do. Like,
Mhm.
it's quite, quite a bit of energy. But we also, so many of us have loved ones and, teachers and people in our life who really want to provide that for us. So that's
Mhm.
the first thing I always recommend. If that's not available, we can also sort of do that process with ourselves. And that's kind of what journaling is. You'll hear people talk about journaling all the time. It is very
Right.
evidence-based, a lot of
A
research that
lot of
suggests it
evidence.
helps.
Mhm.
And I like to start by just being like, all right, what am I feeling? And what is this feeling trying to tell me? And just writing or talking, I do a lot of talk to text into the phone. You can do that too.
Mhm.
Just talking out loud or thinking, in writing about what am I feeling? Why is this coming up? What does this emotion need from me? What does this emotion want from me?
Mhm. Yeah, those are good tips. So like, so the piece is if you don't have a trusted loved one near you at that moment, or
Mm-hmm.
if you're feeling really isolated, then you can go to journaling.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're getting into, because that's sort of about the name entertainment, but it's also getting into like the regulation, because we might start to regulate ourselves, which means, let's say I'm at a 10 and I start to write or take care of myself in some way, that might come down to like a 5 or 6. And when that comes down, our thinking brain goes, yeah. So then we
Mm-hmm.
can problem solve. And I think we've all felt that, where when you're in the heat of something, you literally cannot, there's no solution. And I think that's a clue too, an emotional clue, is if you're in that kind of, like they call it black or white thinking, like that's
Mm-hmm.
literally, you're here. If you really
Mm-hmm.
think there's no hope, you're here, and you
Mm-hmm.
have to get yourself here.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like it's almost like getting yourself to home base. It's
Yeah,
like,
I sometimes will say, like, I want you to have access to all of your brain as you're thinking about this, or as you're
mm,
trying to decide. Like, I
right,
want you to have access to all of it. Like maybe there is, parts of this that can't be changed, and maybe there's other parts that can. And it's hard to
right,
know when we're like this,
right.
because we're missing so much when we're just in that like reaction part of the brain.
Do you help your clients to become aware of when they're like this? So
Mm,
maybe they show up and they're having they're not showing you this, but
mm-hmm,
they're telling you, I'm not happy in my life. Things aren't working out. My relationships, my this, my that, it's not going well.
mm-hmm,
Obviously they're here, right? Because they're not able
mm-hmm.
to problem solve. So do you help clients like figure out, or do you think that's valuable to figure out? These are the things that are,
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it. It's like that is a lot of what I'm doing, and a lot of what we do in our
Mhm.
work, and what helps is to be like, what I always want to do with folks is start by just pausing, because I think when we're here, we go so fast, just like bouncing all over, or just so
Right.
stuck and not moving at all. And what I always like to do is pause and ask, like, what's happening for you right now? If you check in, like, what do you notice? Sometimes
Mhm.
I'll ask, like, specifically below the neck, if you scan, what do you notice? What's happening?
Mhm.
And then once we start to check in and notice and then say it out loud is when we'll start to notice this happening. And I'll notice that when they start to calm down, like they either move a little bit slower or speak a little slower, or they have more energy, speak a little bit more, kind of going to more of a place of that like homeostasis that your body wants
Yeah.
to bring you to.
Yeah.
But we start with, let me check in, like, what's going on? What are you noticing? What's happening for you
Mhm.
right now? Oh, I'm feeling my stomach actually hurts. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't really realize I have a knot in my stomach. Oh, and there's like a ball in my
Mhm.
throat here. And we might even
Mhm.
just touch those parts of the body and be like, all right,
Mhm.
just be with that for just a moment. Take a breath there. And that, even just that process of slowing it down really
Mhm.
helps us to do this and start to be able to think about whatever's happening differently.
Yeah. And that's the key, is that so
Hmm.
you can think about it differently.
Hmm.
So I want to make sure people are really hearing that. Like that is what we're talking about. We want you to have more access so that yet we all get this way, and some of us are more reactive due to a lot of reasons, but you can start to learn like, oh, these are the things that are getting me, and I can do some things like checking in with my body, those kind of things, to bring myself back to, like you said, homeostasis, and then I can problem solve. Because I know I've had that experience. I'm sure lots of people have, where you're just like, why didn't I see that? You see the solution, it's right there, but you can't see it when you're like this. You just like, it's literally like literally the body sending chemical signals to that part of the brain to like shut down.
Yeah, it's in the same way that when we're like this, like if we're really angry, we will say or do things that later we're like, why did I do that? Oh my God. You know, like I should not, you know, when you're like this, you're like, I would never do that. And, you know, and so that's why it's so helpful to be like, all right, I'm noticing that I'm really, this emotion is really big. I know that when my emotion's really big, I lose access to parts of my brain, and my priority becomes not solving the emotion, but checking in with my body, naming what's happening for me, helping my brain to come back online. And then I'm going to have more information to act in the way that's aligned with who I want to be and how I want to treat people and how I want to treat myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. All of that. So true. And having more access gives us more options. And
yeah, it helps us to
safe.
Be more graceful in the way we react to things. And and I think it comes back to, what kind of person do I want to be, and what are my values, what matters to me. If it matters to me to treat people with respect and kindness, then when I'm really angry, it can feel, that can get a little bit trickier, right?
Right, absolutely. And and what a good thing to bring up, because it's another invitation to say, yeah, what is important to me? Because I think sometimes we really let emotions drive us, and we don't understand, like, we have some control, and we can also say, oh, that's not, I don't want to be seen that way. So maybe I have some work to do, or, you know, maybe I need to spend more time with myself, or journaling, or whatever. Like, but really just, I think some of this is really simple. Once you get it, it's like, the more you say to yourself, what am I feeling? Even if you're feeling good, like, what is this? Oh, I feel content. And we didn't put it up, but I'll put it in the notes so people have access to it. But there's a emotion wheel, and this thing is huge. It's got so many layers to it of different emotions. And I think that's another thing, is like giving ourselves words for it, because we, like you said, there's a lot of, you know, we feel bad. Like, you hear that a lot. Like, I feel bad. What does that mean? And like getting more curious and being like, oh, actually, I feel sad. Not, and I feel bad. My body feels bad, but it's sad because I saw this, or I heard this, or whatever.
Yeah, and the wheel is such a great place to start if this is not a practice you've been doing. If you don't really know how to name your emotions yet, I always find having a wheel and being like, all right, let me start in the middle. Which of those 5 is it? Okay, it's closest to this. Let me go out. Which is it closest to? Because as you practice that, then you're not going to need the wheel in the future, right? Because you start to know yourself better. And that's regulation.
That's regulation. That's great. Thanks, Summer. That was a good conversation.
Oh yeah, thank you so much for having me, as always.
Yeah,
such a pleasure.
We're always glad to have you. And just as a reminder, you can find our other intermissions on our YouTube channel or on our website. And Summer has done several webinars for us. She talked about overwhelming feelings at work, how to manage a difficult work situation. You did a great one on boundaries I think it was last December. So so please come check them out. And I'm sure, Summer, you can be found online.
Yes, ma'am. I'm online. So you can find me on Instagram. You can go to my website. I've got blog posts up and posting on Instagram all the time. So
yeah, no, I'm glad you just plugged your blog, because I meant to plug. I read some, and they're helpful. It's really helpful. Yeah, your content's always brings it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next time here on Intermission.